Assalamu alaikum. As usual, welcome to the episode of Friends of Bangladeshi. As you know, we bring special people who are our friends to this program, and today is no exception. Before we go to the discussion, let's go and see a video clip.
Dr. Anna Livingstone has been a junior doctor and a general practitioner for more than 30 years. But for the Bangladeshi community in London, she has just not been a doctor, she has been one of the closest friends in hardest of time. In the 70s, when training to become a doctor, she was actively involved in the anti-racist movement and stood shoulder to shoulder with the Bangladeshi community against the National Front. While working as a junior doctor, she advocated the importance of hiring interpreter for better diagnostic of disease and providing better health care. She also worked with the community to raise awareness about learning and physical disabilities. She visited Bangladesh several times with friendship projects between Bangladesh and the United Kingdom. For the kindness and friendship shown by Dr. Anna Livingstone, Bangladeshi community in London are very grateful.
Welcome back. Today, as I said, we have a very special guest, and the lady is none other than Dr. Anna Livingstone. So, welcome to the studio. Thank you very much for coming. When did you start your medical career?
I trained in medicine in the London Hospital in Whitechapel starting in 1973.
Whitechapel?
After I'd studied something else.
Okay. So, that was how long ago?
44 years.
Say it again, what did you say in Bangla?
Onko hortam farinai.
Excellent, well done.
Medicine korbar age ami onko study korslam.
Onko study korsila. Very good, very good. You got to know the Bangladeshi community, the Sylheti community within the East London area, Tower Hamlets. So then you became a GP?
Yes, but before I became a GP, I was involved with a lot of patients, both as a student and as a junior doctor in many areas, including maternity care. And also I was involved in the opposition of people in the local community who didn't like the situation of racial violence around Brick Lane. So I was involved in a number of different ways with the local community there.
We'll come to that in a minute. So, are you still practicing?
Well, I went into general practice after I finished the 3-year course as a doctor, training in general practice in 1983 in Limehouse. And I'm nearly completely retired.
Okay.
But I do some general practice and some other things related to healthcare, for example, around drugs and alcohol problems.
Did you have many Bangladeshi origin patients?
When I was a trainee GP, I was for 6 months in Spitalfields, so that was very difficult as the doctors were men and not Bangladeshi. So I used to have a lot of Bangladeshi women who couldn't speak English, and I could so it was mostly sign language. And then when I went to Limehouse, there were only a few families, but things changed very rapidly. And as the community changed, I had more and more Bangladeshi patients of first, second, third generation and onwards.
So you said about sign language.
Yes.
And because I'm sure you understand quite a bit of Sylheti now, but those days, how did you manage to treat them?
Well, it was difficult. I did go to 2 or 3 classes, but they weren't very effective. So I extended my vocabulary slightly, and I had no shame, because if you can't communicate with someone, how can you work with them?
Did you have an interpreter?
Not in those days.
Not in those
days. I was involved when I was working in Limehouse in the development of advocacy services around the NHS, Chinese and Bangladeshi, Bengali speaking. And so that was really the end of the 80s, the early 90s. But taking us back to the early 80s, when I was a junior hospital doctor in maternity at Mile End, the doctors would call a porter named Ali
Okay.
to the maternity ward if the women needed something like a cesarean operation. And it was very embarrassing for him and very embarrassing for the women. And he wasn't trained, but he did his best. So this I felt was a very unsatisfactory situation. So I and some others campaigned and pushed for interpreters and advocates.
Good. So during your period as GP and your patients, Bangladeshi patients, what sort of areas did you find, health issues within the Bangladeshi community, which was different to the other communities?
A lot of the areas are very similar. There are particular things that affect people who are themselves migrants, more likely to feel isolated and depressed, especially women who have no command of English and either feel stuck within the community or else early on who had very few contacts. Though over the years we've become more and more aware of the
Did
high
you treat many diabetes and heart patients?
Well, that's what I was going
because
to say.
It is a high
over the
risk
years
area.
it became, when I started in general practice, we saw children coming from Bangladesh, babies who are quite malnourished, poor and thin. But over the years the things have changed, and that people are eating more across the community, whether white Bangladeshi or whatever. But Asian people seem to have a particular high risk of getting diabetes. So, of course, we've been seeing a large number of people with diabetes
obesity?
at young ages, and increasing weight. So the very thin people have become very large people, and heart disease has been a huge problem in the community, and then quite a lot of eczema and asthma and those sorts of problems, in addition to problems which are social and psychological with mental health. Everybody has their fair share of illnesses like schizophrenia, but just feeling fed up and lonely and miserable and your body hurting is something that happens to people who are depressed.
All right. So when a conversation takes place between Bangladeshis, do you understand what they're talking about?
It depends what it's about, how completely I understand. So, say it's around health issues, I usually understand everything, although, of course, okay,
very good. Now, those days there were a lot of issues relating to race.
Oh, racism.
And were you ever involved with any racial issues?
I was certainly involved. I have always been involved in anti-racist movements and anti-movements against religious prejudice and movements for women. And in the early days in Tower Hamlets, as you know, Brick Lane was a dangerous area, particularly for Bangladeshi people. And at the north end of Brick Lane, just north of the railway bridge on the Bethnal Green side, the National Front, who was what the BNP is now, were organised and would stand there and commit violent acts and so on. And the Bangladeshi youth and the white left, really, and I would regard myself as left-wing. We were not extremists, but we stood there and said, we have to stop these people coming down Brick Lane. So I was involved in that. And then in the late 1970s, while I was just finishing being a student, a big movement was set up, which was called Rock Against Racism, which was young British people making popular music, but against racism. And actually in Victoria Park, there was a huge concert in, it's actually, I think, this year, 40 years ago, in Victoria Park. And this concert was set up with very well-known groups, and we all demonstrated from Trafalgar Square to the concert. And the people in the concert, they had no mobile phones, they had no idea. And suddenly 100 or 200,000 people arrived. So it was a big movement against racism, Bangladeshi and non-Bangladeshi people together in the streets, but also across the community of London, and it involved young people.
Well, thank you for that. Have you ever met Altaf Ali, who gave his life?
No,
was martyred?
I'm not aware of meeting him, although I was
Okay.
very much involved in the activity and the protests and so on around his death. And the naming of the park was something that was very
Altaf Ali
symbolic.
Park, yes. Yes. So those days, people could not speak English very well. They had language difficulty, and they had to get help from every angle. And you played a very good part, I think. Yes?
Well, I think that that's the least we're all human.
Yes, yes. Yes. Together. Ekla kub durbol, ekloge shakti. Very good, very good. Things have changed now. All these years, it's about 3-4 decades now. And tell us about your health advocacy. You were involved with health?
Well, during the 80s, I think many, as well as the people living in the Bangla community, the Chinese community, Vietnamese community, Somalis and so on, many of the health workers, health visitors, GPs, hospital staff and so on, were becoming frustrated because nobody wanted to treat people as being an animal that they could never understand. And so in various different ways, services were set up involving mostly people living in the community of Tower Hamlets, sometimes people coming from outside, as interpreters but advocates. That meant more than interpreting. That meant that the person would be speaking for the patient or the family and for the doctor and having an extended role, and I was involved in that.
Severe learning difficulties?
Well, this is 30 years ago. It became clear that there were more Bangla families had people with severe learning disabilities and physical disabilities. And in addition to that, there was what is called stigma. There was shame. For many people felt that they could not go out there, and everybody, this is common across the community, Bangla or non-Bangla.
We'll continue our discussion. We have to go for a break because we are having a very fruitful discussion and learning a lot about the Bangladeshi community those days and the contribution made by our friend. We'll be back soon. Don't go away. Welcome back. We have today a friend of Bangladeshi, Dr. Anna, here today, and we are discussing various issues, and we were talking about learning difficulties.
Yes.
So
learning and physical difficulties among children it was realised this was a huge problem. There were many people in this position, and families were very sad and finding it very difficult communicating with professionals, getting support, going out from the home, and other members of the family.
Did you get funding?
Well, I was not. I was only involved. I wasn't involved in the founding of it, but I was around and aware of this. So this research was done, and the research showed that.
I mean, the funds.
Well, the research showed that it would be helpful to have workers who became skilled, bilingual Bangladeshi workers who became skilled at talking with people, helping them, talking to them at home, helping them come out of themselves and use the services. Now, this service has been running for 30 years.
30 years.
And I have become more involved in the last 2 or 3 years when the service members' parents asked me if I could, with my colleague Dr. Jackie Appleby, become more involved because their service was under threat. And unfortunately, the service for children, for the parents and families of children, was cut a year or two ago. And on the 31st of July, despite the parents making it clear this was an equalities issue and parents obviously being very upset and unhappy about losing the service. This service was cut by ELFT, which is the mental health service locally, which has
So
this
do you
service.
think there is enough funding now to address all these
This is
issues?
actually a very cheap service. First of all, although these women are extraordinarily skilled, because they don't hold a professional qualification like being a doctor, although they've been on much training, they don't earn a great deal of money. Secondly, the cost to the community and to the NHS and to social services of people becoming more depressed, not attending appointments, children becoming more dependent at home, the need for more social care and so on, the cost of not having the service is actually going to be higher than the very low cost of having the service. But I think it is a major equalities issue. There's gender for the women, there's the question of the Bangladeshi community and any other communities who have children and young people and even older people who are their biological children with learning difficulties, who cannot access services because they can't speak English and they haven't had chance to go to English classes because they've been looking after the children. So there's gender, there's deprivation. This is a deprived area. These families are more poor because people haven't been able to go to work and get more money. Children have fallen behind at school, and there's direct disability discrimination. So I would like to see this service reinstated, and I hope people think again.
So let's talk about racism again. So I think it's 1970s you were involved with the community since
Yes,
1970.
since then, really.
So going back to 1970, then 80, 90, 2000 and now, do you think the race issue still exists?
Well, I think it's a different. There's no doubt that racism still exists. And one of the things that's happened with poor people from Eastern European coming to work in Britain is that they've been experiencing. I went with some friends to the Natural History Museum at the weekend. I have a badge, which is not on me now, which says Health Workers Against Racism. The person checking the bag said, I'm Polish. I experienced terrible racism when I arrived here, and I'm so glad that people like you are standing up against racism. So racism is not only to do with what our skin looks like.
How
or
about,
anything like that. And in
institutional
well, there's
racism?
institutional racism. There are what they call glass ceilings,
That's right.
promotion and so on. But there's also racism in the street, and our governments nationally and internationally tend to divide people against one another, because that avoids that. If they blame the failure of the NHS on Europe, or the failure of them to build houses on black people or whatever, then that gets them off. That means that they don't have to invest money and develop the services we need. We all need these services, and racism is a way that people are divided. But on the other hand, I would say that I find it very cheering how so many people in Tower Hamlets get on very well together. And, you know, you have Cockneys of all ethnic backgrounds, and everybody, you know, when in my practice, we have a WhatsApp group and people write to one another, and everybody, white, black, Asian, says Eid Mubarak to one another and Happy Christmas, and tells one another about their holidays. And this is also how you'd like to see the world.
Right. Okay. So in 1990s, I think we had another hiccup with racism.
Oh, yes, we did
there
indeed,
was
yes.
There was a councillor
Yes.
from an extreme party.
Yes, the British National Party councillor was elected on the Isle of Dogs in 1993, and Derek Beacon he was called, and this was a terrible situation.
So you attended many demonstrations and so
racism
on.
really built up, and we were involved in a project across Tower Hamlets looking at whether general practice was as good at checking health problems among Bangladeshis as whites. And there were interpreters and bilingual interviewers involved in this. Actually, it showed we were as good at doing it. But the thing is that they experienced quite a lot of racism in the streets, so we had to provide protection as well. And we went on the huge demonstration in Welling, again, with many of the Bangladeshi workers in the health service and many non-Bangladeshi people. It was a huge demonstration against the British National Party.
Thank you. Thank you. During the Iraq War,
Yes.
did you take part in any demonstration?
What
or
do you think?
you say?
Of course I did. It was an outrage, the bombing of Iraq. What they, in the PREVENT program, they say a terrorism is somebody who does this sort of, terrorist is someone who does this sort of thing to people, but the British and Americans bombing Iraq was appalling. And that does not mean I was in any way a supporter of the dictator Saddam Hussein, who did terrible things to people. I think we have to be clear about that. But I was part of the movement. I was on demonstrations. I had stuff on my wall in the surgery saying against the war.
Have you visited Bangladesh?
Yes, I think I've been about 5 times.
First
First time I went quickly with my husband and my daughter in 1991 when Ershad had just been overthrown, because I wanted to see what Bangladesh was like. And we were visiting our family in India, and I've been 4 other times partly involved in a project, Moetri exchange between Bangladesh healthcare.
What exchange? Moetri?
It's called the Moetri project. With Dr. Haruna Rashid, Maggie Falshaw, local practice manager, and others. And we shared healthcare across countries. We learnt from one another.
Excellent. Did you ever visit Sylhet?
Yes, each time.
Each time. What is your experience?
I love grammar zagat khub shundo.
Khub shundo.
Shundo. Kintu. Khun shohar khub baro.
How about hospitality of people?
Everybody was always very hospitable, and I loved the way there would be big banners welcoming us when we did the health project. And when we went in 1990, nobody expected us, and they took us everywhere. It was great.
You did work on arsenic?
Well, I worked, our project was with the Dhaka Community Hospital Trust, which was partnered with us, although it had health camps in Pabna and in Sylhet and so on, and they were working on arsenic. So I was a little bit involved, but I didn't. I've seen the pumps with the red mark and so on. But I was not. The main work we were involved in was developing primary care.
Tell us about your experience since 1970s, the Bangladeshi community and the Bangladeshi community now. What changes have you noticed?
More diabetes and bigger people, amazing educational achievement, women doing really well. That bringing in some ways, for some...
3 MPs, 1 in the House of Lords
well,
on
there's
top
all
of that.
But I'm most interested not in the big people, whatever their ethnic group, but I'm interested in how everybody's succeeding. And I think that the successes in schools, the involvement in the workforce, the way that people are standing up for themselves.
Tower Hamlets is doing very well, isn't it?
It's doing very
With
well.
education.
Excellent.
So, but do you think there are more scope to do better things?
Yes, I think there's much more scope, and at the same time we're receiving from 20% plus cuts in schools, and the health services being cut, and then we need to stand up together to say this. If we're going to see equality and everybody's going to be able to develop to their best potential, then money and support needs to go into areas like ours.
What is your message to the community?
We are all one community, and the Bangladeshi community is a part of a whole community. Together we stand, and we need to have ambitions that are high, not just for individuals but for everybody. So we need to support one another nationally and internationally, because the world should be one community. Whether it's Rohingya or the people in the hurricanes or people in Iraq and Syria or here, we are one community. One community.
Well, it has been very fruitful discussion with you. We have learned a lot. Unfortunately, we always run out of time. But in future, we'll have a lengthy discussion. We'll take your interview. But unfortunately, we'll have to conclude today. And thank you very much for coming today and being with us. We wish you all the best, and stay with us, with our community, because you have gained experience, I think, for over 4 decades now. Viewers, on Friends of Bangladeshi today, we had Dr. Anna Livingstone. She has lived in East London all this time. She has visited Bangladesh many times. She knows the community very well, and she has been helping the community in every angle, you name it. Thank you very much. Stay with Channel S. We'll see you soon.